Marcus had always been the kind of man who could light up a room with just his presence. Before the war, his friends would joke that his smile was infectious, spreading from person to person like ripples across still water. Children would run to him on the street, drawn by his warm laugh and the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was genuinely happy. His mother used to say he had inherited his father's gift for making people feel seen and valued, even in the briefest of encounters. The small town of Millbrook had known Marcus since he was a boy who climbed every tree and befriended every stray dog that wandered through the streets. He worked at Henderson's hardware store after high school, and customers would often linger longer than necessary just to chat with him about their weekend plans or their grandchildren's latest achievements. Mrs. Patterson, who lived alone since her husband passed, would come in every Tuesday not because she needed anything, but because Marcus always remembered to ask about her garden and her arthritis. When Elena first arrived in town 3 years before the war, she noticed Marcus immediately. Not because he was particularly handsome, though his sandy brown hair and steady green eyes were certainly pleasant to look at, but because of the way he moved through the world with such genuine warmth. She was working as a nurse at the local clinic then, having moved from the city to escape the constant noise and rush of urban life. Millbrook offered her something she had been searching for without really knowing it, a sense of community, of belonging. Their courtship was gentle and unhurried, like everything else in Millbrook. Marcus would stop by the clinic with fresh coffee from Murphy's Diner, claiming he was just passing through on his way to work. Elena would find excuses to walk past Henderson's hardware, sometimes picking up items she didn't really need just to see his face brighten when she entered the store. They would take long walks along Millbrook Creek on Sunday afternoons, talking about books they had read, places they hoped to visit someday, and dreams they had never shared with anyone else. The engagement ring was simple, a modest diamond that caught the light beautifully, purchased with money Marcus had been saving for over a year. He proposed on the same creek bank where they had shared their first real conversation, getting down on one knee just as the sun was setting behind the old oak trees. Elena said yes before he had even finished asking the question, tears streaming down her face as she realized she had found not just love but home. Their wedding was planned for the spring of 1943. Elena had already picked out her dress, a simple white gown that her seamstress aunt was altering to fit perfectly. Marcus had arranged for the church social hall for the reception, and his mother had begun planning a menu that would feed half the town. They talked about children, about buying the small house on Maple Street that had just gone up for sale, about growing old together in the same community that had watched them both become adults. But history had other plans. The draft notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, delivered by young Tommy Morrison, who worked part-time for the Postal Service. Marcus read it twice, his hand steady but his face growing pale. Elena was at work when he received it, and he spent the entire day trying to figure out how to tell her, how to explain that their carefully laid plans would have to wait for an indefinite amount of time. When he finally found the words that evening, sitting on her tiny apartment couch with the letter folded in his shirt pocket, Elena listened in silence. She didn't cry, didn't plead with him to find a way out of it. Instead, she took his hands in hers and told him she would wait, that she would be there when he came home, that their love was strong enough to survive whatever distance and time might put between them. The last few weeks before his departure passed in a blur of preparations and stolen moments. They moved their wedding date up, having a simple ceremony at the courthouse, with only their immediate families present. Elena wore a blue dress instead of her white gown, saving that for the real celebration they would have when Marcus returned. They spent their brief honeymoon at Miller's Lake, 20 miles outside of town, talking until dawn and making promises they both hoped they could keep. On the day Marcus left for training camp, it seemed like the entire town had come to see him off at the train station. Old Mr. Henderson shook his hand and told him his job would be waiting when he returned. Mrs. Patterson pressed a small package of homemade cookies into his hands, her eyes red from crying. The other young men who were leaving looked nervous and excited, chattering about the adventure ahead of them, about seeing the world and serving their country. Marcus wasn't nervous or excited. He was terrified of losing what he had found, of forgetting the feeling of Elena's hand in his, of returning to find that life had moved on without him. As the train pulled away from the platform, he watched Elena standing there in her red coat, waving until he couldn't see her anymore. She had promised to write every day, and he had promised to come back to her with his smile intact. Neither of them understood then how difficult promises could be to keep, or how war had a way of taking things that seemed impossible to lose. Marcus carried Elena's photograph in his chest pocket and her letters in his kit bag, reading them so often that the paper became soft and worn at the creases. He wrote back whenever he could, telling her about his fellow soldiers, about the places they were stationed, about counting the days until he could return to Millbrook and resume the life they had planned together. For the first year, his letters were filled with humor and hope, small observations about military life that made Elena laugh out loud when she read them alone in her apartment. He wrote about the friends he had made, about the absurdities of army bureaucracy, about how much he missed Murphy's coffee and Henderson's familiar organized chaos. But as time passed and his unit was deployed overseas, the tone of his letters began to change in ways that Elena couldn't quite identify, but felt deeply in her chest every time she read them. The changes in Marcus began subtly, like shadows creeping across a field at dusk. His unit had been deployed to the Pacific Theater, stationed on islands whose names Elena had to look up on maps at the library. The tropical heat, he wrote, was unlike anything he had experienced in Millbrook, where even the hottest summer days eventually gave way to cool evenings by the creek. But it wasn't the climate that was changing him. It was what he witnessed there, what he was forced to do, what he learned about the capacity for both heroism and horror that existed within ordinary men. Elena noticed the shift first in the spacing between his letters. What had been daily correspondence became weekly, then sporadic. When letters did arrive, they were shorter, less detailed, filled with observations about the weather or questions about people back home rather than stories about his experiences. He stopped mentioning his fellow soldiers by name, stopped sharing the small moments of camaraderie that had once filled his pages with warmth and humor. The townspeople would ask Elena how Marcus was doing whenever she walked to the post office or stopped at Murphy's diner for lunch. She would smile and say he was fine, that he was serving his country with honor, that he would be home soon. But privately, she began to worry about the man who was writing these increasingly distant letters, wondering if the Marcus she had married was slowly disappearing into someone she might not recognize when he returned. Dr. Williams, the elderly physician who ran the clinic where Elena worked, had served in the First War. Sometimes during quiet moments between patients, he would talk to her about what combat could do to a man's spirit, how some soldiers came home carrying invisible wounds that were harder to treat than any physical injury. He spoke gently but honestly about shell shock, about men who had seen too much and carried too much, about the importance of patience and understanding when they finally made it back to civilian life. Elena threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, as if staying busy enough could somehow protect Marcus from whatever was happening to him, thousands of miles away. She volunteered at the Red Cross on weekends, rolling bandages and packing care packages. She organized letter-writing campaigns for other soldiers who had no one back home to correspond with. She helped tend victory gardens and collected scrap, metal for the war effort, finding comfort in the belief that every small action somehow contributed to bringing the war to an end and bringing Marcus home. The last letter she received from him was different from all the others. It arrived on a Thursday in October, nearly 6 months before the war would officially end, and it contained only a few sentences. Marcus wrote that he was safe, that his unit was moving to a new location, and that he would write again when he could. But at the bottom of the page, in handwriting that looked shakier than usual, he had added something that made Elena's heart clench with fear. "Sometimes I can't remember what it feels like to smile. Don't worry about me. Just remember that I love you." She read those words dozens of times, carrying the letter with her everywhere she went, trying to decode what Marcus was really trying to tell her. She wrote back immediately, filling pages with memories of their time together, reminding him of moments that had made him laugh, describing in detail the way his face looked when he was truly happy. She told him about the changes in Millbrook, about babies who had been born while he was away, about seasonal changes and community events. trying to paint pictures of home that might anchor him to the person he had been before the war. When Germany surrendered in May of 1945, the town celebrated with a parade down Main Street and a community picnic in Miller's Park. Elena attended because she felt it was expected of her, but her heart wasn't in the festivities. The war in the Pacific was still ongoing, and Marcus was still somewhere in that vast ocean, still writing letters that revealed less and less about his inner state with each passing month. The news of Japan's surrender reached Millbrook on a Tuesday evening in August. Church bells rang throughout the town, car horns honked incessantly, and people poured into the streets to celebrate. Elena stood on her apartment balcony, watching, her neighbors embrace and cry and laugh with relief, feeling a complex mixture of joy and apprehension. The war was over, which meant Marcus would be coming home, but she no longer knew what version of him would return to her. The demobilization process was slow and bureaucratic. Soldiers were processed out of service based on a point system that took into account length of service, time overseas, and family circumstances. Elena received an official notification that Marcus would be discharged in November and would arrive back in Millbrook sometime in December, but no specific date was provided. She began preparing for his return with the same methodical attention to detail she brought to her nursing work. She had saved money throughout the war years and used it to rent the small house on Maple Street they had talked about before he left. She furnished it simply but warmly, hanging curtains she had sewn herself and placing photographs from their brief time together on the mantelpiece. She wanted everything to be perfect, to show Marcus that she had kept their dreams alive while he was gone, that she was ready to resume the life they had planned together. But as December approached, Elena found herself struggling with anxiety she couldn't quite articulate. She loved Marcus deeply and had waited faithfully for him throughout the war, but she was no longer certain that love alone would be enough to bridge whatever distance had grown between them. The man who had left Millbrook had been open and expressive, someone who wore his emotions clearly on his face. The man who had written those final sparse letters seemed to have retreated into himself in ways that she didn't know how to reach. Dr. Williams, sensing her apprehension, shared more stories about soldiers returning from war, about the adjustment period that was often more difficult than anyone anticipated. He explained that combat veterans sometimes struggled with feeling disconnected from civilian life, that they might have trouble sleeping or concentrating, that they often felt guilty about surviving when their friends had not. He encouraged Elena to be patient, to give Marcus time to readjust, to seek help if the symptoms of what people were beginning to recognize as combat fatigue became severe. The telegram announcing Marcus's arrival came on a snowy Wednesday morning in mid-December. He would be on the 3:15 train on Friday afternoon, it said, and Elena felt her stomach twist with a mixture of excitement and dread as she realized that, after nearly 3 years of separation, she would finally see her husband again. She took the afternoon off work and spent hours deciding what to wear, finally settling on the same red coat she had worn when he left, hoping it might spark some recognition, some memory of the connection they had once shared so effortlessly. The train arrived 20 minutes late on that December afternoon, its whistle echoing across the snow-covered platform where Elena stood with a dozen other families waiting for their soldiers to come home. She watched as men in uniform began, stepping down from the cars, carrying duffel bags and wearing expressions that ranged from eager anticipation to quiet uncertainty. Some were immediately engulfed in embraces from wives and children and parents who had been counting the days until this moment. Others stood more hesitantly, as if they needed time to remember how to be civilians again. Elena spotted Marcus before. He saw her. He was thinner than when he had left, his face more angular, his shoulders carrying himself differently than she remembered. He moved with a careful deliberateness that was new, scanning the crowd with eyes that seemed to take in everything and nothing at the same time. When their eyes finally met across the platform, Elena felt her heart stop for a moment. There was recognition there, and love, but also something else. A distance that hadn't existed in any of his photographs or letters, a guardedness that made him seem like a stranger wearing her husband's face. Their embrace was awkward at first, both of them uncertain about how to bridge the physical space that represented so much more than just the months they had been apart. Marcus held her gently as if she might break, and Elena could feel the tension in his body, the way he seemed to be holding himself back even as he was holding her close. They stood there for a long time, not speaking, while around them other reunions played out with more obvious joy and celebration. The drive back to their new house was filled with stilted conversation about safe topics. The weather, changes, in the town, mutual friends who had married or moved away while Marcus was overseas. Elena found herself chattering nervously, trying to fill silences that had never existed between them before the war. Marcus responded politely but briefly, looking out the window at streets that must have seemed both familiar and strange after so much time away. When they reached the house on Maple Street, Elena watched Marcus's face carefully for his reaction. She had worked so hard to make it perfect, to create a space that would feel like the home they had dreamed about together. He smiled when he saw it, but the expression didn't reach his eyes the way it used to. He thanked her for everything she had done, told her it was beautiful, carried his bag inside and looked around with the appreciation of someone viewing a well-appointed hotel room rather than his own home. The first few weeks of Marcus's return were characterized by careful politeness and gentle distance. He was unfailingly kind to Elena, helping with household chores, accompanying her to church on Sundays, making an effort to re-establish connections with old friends and neighbors. But it was all performed with a sort of deliberate normalcy that felt more exhausting than authentic. The spontaneous laughter that had once been his signature was gone, replaced by measured responses that suggested he was thinking carefully about everything before allowing it to show on his face. Elena found herself walking on eggshells, afraid to ask direct questions about his experiences overseas, uncertain about how to reach the person she loved who seemed to be living just slightly out of reach. She would catch him sometimes staring into space with an expression she couldn't interpret, and when she asked what he was thinking about, he would shake his head and say it was nothing important. At night, he would lie very still beside her, in bed, but she could tell from his breathing that he wasn't sleeping, that he was somewhere else entirely, even when his body was right there next to hers. The nightmares started about a month after his return. Elena would wake to find Marcus sitting up in bed, breathing hard, his shirt soaked with sweat. When she would try to comfort him, he would apologize and say he was fine, that it was just a bad dream, but he wouldn't or couldn't tell her what the dreams were about. During the day, sudden loud noises would make him flinch in ways that broke Elena's heart. The backfire of a car, the slamming of a door, even children playing too loudly in the street could cause him to freeze momentarily, his eyes scanning for threats that existed only in his memory. Dr. Williams, who had been observing Marcus during his occasional visits to the clinic, suggested gently that many veterans were struggling with similar adjustment difficulties. He used careful clinical language to describe what was happening, explaining that Marcus's mind was still processing experiences that were too overwhelming to fully understand or accept. He recommended patience, routine, and possibly consultation with specialists who were beginning to develop treatments for what they were calling combat fatigue syndrome. But Marcus refused to acknowledge that anything was seriously wrong. He insisted that he just needed time to readjust, that he was grateful to be home and determined to build the life he and Elena had planned before the war. He found work at a construction company that was building new housing for returning veterans, and he threw himself into the physical labor with an intensity that seemed designed to exhaust himself completely by the end of each day. Elena understood that he was trying to use work as a way to avoid dealing with whatever was haunting him, but she didn't know how to help someone who insisted he didn't need help. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult part. Marcus had once been the kind of person who drew people to him effortlessly, but now he seemed to actively avoid social situations that had once energized him. When old friends stopped by to welcome him home, he was polite but distant. At church, he sat quietly beside Elena, participating in the rituals but seeming disconnected from the community that had once meant so much to him. Mrs. Patterson, who had looked forward to his return throughout the war, commented sadly to Elena that it was like Marcus had forgotten how to let people care about him. Elena began to understand that the war had taken more from Marcus than just time. It had stolen his fundamental trust in the world's goodness, his belief that people were generally kind and that life was something to be celebrated rather than simply endured. The man who had once seen potential friends in every stranger now seemed to view other people as puzzles to be solved or threats to be managed rather than connections to be enjoyed. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a restlessness in Marcus that Elena couldn't quite understand. He would take long walks by himself, sometimes disappearing for hours without explanation. He would stand in their backyard, looking at the trees Elena had planted, but his expression suggested he was seeing something entirely different from the peaceful suburban scene that surrounded him. When she would ask what he was thinking about during these moments, he would give her the same answer he always gave, that it was nothing important, nothing she needed to worry about. But Elena was worrying constantly now, feeling like she was watching the man she loved disappear a little more each day into a place she couldn't follow. She began to realize that bringing Marcus home had been only the first step in a much longer journey, one that might require more strength and patience than either of them had imagined when they promised to wait for each other through whatever the war might bring. By summer, the careful politeness that had characterized Marcus and Elena's reunion was beginning to crack under the weight of unspoken frustrations and accumulated silences. Elena found herself alternating between overwhelming compassion for her husband's obvious suffering and a growing resentment that felt selfish and terrible, but impossible to ignore. She had waited faithfully for 3 years, had built their home and planned their future and imagined their reunion countless times, but none of her imaginings had prepared her for the reality of living with someone who seemed to be present in body but absent in spirit. The breaking point came on a humid July evening when Elena suggested they attend the annual summer festival at Miller's Park. It was the kind of community event that Marcus had always loved before the war. Families gathered for picnics, children running between the booths, music playing from the bandstand, everyone celebrating the simple pleasure of being together on a beautiful evening. Elena thought it might help Marcus reconnect with the town and the people who had missed him while he was away. Marcus agreed to go, but from the moment they arrived at the park, Elena could see that it was a mistake. The crowd seemed to overwhelm him, and the sounds of celebration, laughter, music, children shouting with delight made him tense and hypervigilant. When the local American Legion post fired a ceremonial cannon to mark the beginning of the evening's festivities, Marcus dropped to the ground so quickly that Elena barely had time to register what was happening. He stayed there for several seconds, crouched behind a picnic table, his eyes scanning the crowd with an intensity that scared her. The embarrassment on Marcus's face when he realized what had happened, how many people had witnessed his reaction, was almost unbearable to watch. He stood up slowly, brushing dirt from his clothes, and told Elena quietly that they should go home. She wanted to protest, to insist that no one was judging him, that everyone understood he had been through experiences they couldn't imagine. But the look in his eyes told her that arguing would only make things worse, so she gathered their things and walked with him in silence back to their car. That night, for the first time since his return, Marcus tried to talk about what was happening to him. He sat on the edge of their bed, his head in his hands, and told Elena in a voice she could barely hear that he didn't know how to be the person she had married anymore. He said he felt like he was watching his life through a window, that everything seemed muffled and distant, like he was wrapped in cotton that prevented him from truly connecting with anything or anyone around him. He apologized for not being the husband she deserved, for bringing home something broken that he didn't know how to fix. Elena held him while he spoke, feeling her own tears falling into his hair, finally understanding that Marcus's withdrawal wasn't about her or their relationship but about something much larger and more devastating. She realized that he wasn't choosing to be distant. He had simply forgotten how to be close, had lost access to parts of himself that the war had apparently damaged beyond his ability to repair alone. The next morning, Elena made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. She told Marcus that she thought they needed help, that what he was experiencing wasn't something he should have to face by himself, that there were doctors who specialized in helping veterans readjust to civilian life. She had been doing research at the library, reading everything she could find about combat fatigue and shell shock, and she had learned about a clinic in the city that was having success, treating soldiers with symptoms similar to Marcus's. Marcus's initial reaction was exactly what Elena had expected: denial, insistence that he could handle his problems on his own. fear that seeking help would mark him as weak or damaged in ways that couldn't be undone. But Elena pressed gently but persistently, explaining that asking for help wasn't a sign of failure but rather a sign of courage, that he had been brave enough to serve his country, and now he needed to be brave enough to take care of himself so he could build the life they both wanted. It took several weeks of careful conversation, but eventually Marcus agreed to visit the clinic. The doctor there, Dr. Reynolds, was himself a veteran of the First War, and spoke to Marcus in language that acknowledged the reality of his experiences without judgment or condescension. He explained that Marcus was suffering from what they were, beginning to understand as a normal response to abnormal circumstances, that his mind was still trying to process trauma that had overwhelmed his ability to cope at the time it occurred. The treatment was slow and often difficult. Marcus attended weekly sessions with Dr. Reynolds, where he gradually began to talk about things he had witnessed and done during the war that he had been trying desperately to forget. He learned techniques for managing the nightmares and the hypervigilance, ways to ground himself in the present moment when his mind tried to transport him back to battlefields thousands of miles away. Some days the sessions left him exhausted and emotionally raw, and Elena learned to give him space while still making sure he knew she was there if he needed her. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, Elena began to see small signs of improvement. Marcus started sleeping through the night more often. He began to show interest in household projects, spending weekends working in their garden or fixing things around the house that had been neglected since his return. He started greeting neighbors more warmly when they encountered them on their walks, and occasionally Elena would catch glimpses of the humor that had once been such a fundamental part of his personality. But progress was not linear, and there were setbacks that sometimes felt devastating. A news report about ongoing conflicts overseas could send Marcus into a silent withdrawal that lasted for days. The death of an elderly neighbor reminded him too vividly of losses he had experienced during the war. Holiday celebrations, which should have been joyful, often triggered memories that made him struggle with guilt about surviving when others had not. Through all of this, Elena was learning her own difficult lessons about patience and love, and the difference between supporting someone and trying to fix them. She attended some sessions with Marcus, where Dr. Reynolds helped her understand that healing from trauma was not something that could be rushed or forced, that sometimes the most loving thing she could do was simply to be present without trying to make everything better. She joined a support group for wives of veterans, where she met other women who were navigating similar challenges and learned that her feelings of frustration and helplessness were normal parts of the adjustment process. As autumn arrived, Elena began to notice that Marcus was initiating conversations more often, asking about her day, expressing opinions about current events, making plans for small projects around the house. The changes were subtle but significant, signs that he was beginning to re-engage with life in ways that had seemed impossible just a few months earlier. His smile, when it appeared, was still hesitant and often brief, but it was genuine in ways that his earlier, performative attempts at normalcy had not been. One evening in October, as they sat on their front porch watching the sunset, Marcus reached for Elena's hand in a gesture that felt spontaneous rather than dutiful. He thanked her for not giving up on him, for fighting for their marriage even when he had been too lost to fight for it himself. Elena squeezed his hand and told him that she had never stopped believing that the man she married was still there, that he just needed time and help to find his way back to himself and to her. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a sense of quiet contemplation that seemed to settle over both Marcus and Elena like a comfortable blanket. The progress Marcus had made through therapy was becoming more apparent in small, everyday moments that might have seemed insignificant to outside observers but felt miraculous to Elena. He had started humming while he shaved in the mornings, a habit from before the war that she had missed more than she had realized. He would comment on news stories over breakfast, offering opinions and observations that showed he was engaging with the world around him rather than simply existing within it. But despite these improvements, Elena noticed that Marcus still seemed to be holding something back, as if there was a final barrier he couldn't quite cross. He was more present, more connected, more like the man she had married. But there was still a cautiousness about him, a reluctance to fully invest himself in happiness, as if he didn't trust it to last. Dr. Reynolds had warned them that recovering from combat trauma was not a straight line, that there might be parts of the healing process that would take years rather than months to complete. It was during this period of careful optimism that Elena made a decision that would surprise both of them. She had been thinking about visiting her sister Anna, who had moved to California before the war to work in the aircraft factories that had sprung up to support the war effort. Anna had written regularly throughout Marcus's absence, offering support and encouragement, and had recently mentioned in her letters that she was planning to move back east, but wanted to spend some time traveling first. She had suggested that Elena might want to join her for a few weeks, to see some of the country and take a break from the intensity of the past year. Elena's initial reaction had been to dismiss the idea immediately. How could she leave Marcus when he was still healing, still working to rebuild himself and their relationship? But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she too needed time to process everything that had happened, to remember who she was outside of her role as caretaker and supporter. She had spent 3 years waiting for Marcus to come home and another year helping him adjust to civilian life. She had been so focused on his needs that she had barely acknowledged her own exhaustion, her own sense of displacement and loss. When she broached the subject with Marcus, his reaction was more encouraging than she had expected. Rather than seeming threatened or abandoned by the idea, he told her he thought it would be good for her to take some time for herself. He said he had been worried about how much of herself she had sacrificed to help him heal, and that he wanted her to have experiences and adventures that weren't centered on managing his recovery. Dr. Reynolds, when consulted, agreed that some time apart might actually be beneficial for both of them, allowing Marcus to test his newfound stability and giving Elena space to reconnect with her own desires and interests. Elena left Millbrook in early March, taking the train west with a mixture of excitement and anxiety she hadn't felt in years. Anna met her at the station in Los Angeles, and Elena was struck by how much her sister had changed during the war years. Anna seemed more confident, more independent, more comfortable taking up space in the world. She had learned to drive, had saved enough money to buy a small car, and had plans to travel all the way to Mexico before eventually settling somewhere on the East Coast. The sisters spent their first week in Los Angeles, where Elena experienced things she had only read about in magazines. They went to movie studios, ate at restaurants that served food from countries she had never heard of, and walked along beaches that stretched for miles in both directions. Anna had friends from all over the country, women who had come west for work during the war and had decided to stay and build new lives for themselves. Elena found herself part of conversations about books and politics and travel that reminded her how much she had missed intellectual stimulation and female friendship. From Los Angeles, they drove south toward Mexico, a journey that took them through landscapes Elena had never imagined. Desert stretched for miles in every direction, punctuated by mountains that seemed to rise directly from the earth without warning. The colors were different from anything in Millbrook, deep oranges, and purples and reds that changed throughout the day as the sun moved across the sky. At night, the stars were so bright and numerous that Elena felt she could reach up and touch them. They crossed the border at Tijuana and continued south to a small coastal town called Ensenada, where Anna had heard they could stay cheaply and experience authentic Mexican culture. Elena had never been outside the United States before, had never heard Spanish spoken as a primary language, had never tasted food seasoned with spices that made her mouth burn pleasantly. Everything was new and overwhelming and wonderful in ways she struggled to describe in the letters she wrote to Marcus every few days. In Ensenada, they stayed in a small hotel run by a family who spoke limited English, but communicated through gestures and smiles and an immediate warmth that made Elena feel welcome despite the language barrier. The town was built around a harbor where fishing boats came and went throughout the day, bringing in catches that were sold at a market that filled the air with sounds and smells unlike anything Elena had ever experienced. She bought small gifts for Marcus, a carved wooden figure, postcards showing scenes of the Pacific Ocean, a bottle of vanilla extract that the vendor assured her was the finest in all of Mexico. But the most significant purchase Elena made was completely impulsive. Walking through the market one morning, she was drawn to a vendor selling leather goods, purses and belts and luggage of all sizes. The man, whose name was Pedro, spoke enough English to explain the craftsmanship that went into each piece, the traditional techniques that had been passed down through generations of his family. Elena found herself looking at a medium-sized suitcase made from rich brown leather that had been tooled with intricate patterns. It was beautiful and practical and completely unnecessary, but something about it spoke to her in a way she couldn't explain. Pedro noticed her interest and began telling her about the leather, how it was treated with oils and dyes that would improve with age and travel. He opened the suitcase to show her the interior, which was lined with fabric and fitted with small pockets and compartments. But what captured Elena's attention was the scent that rose from the interior. Not just the leather, but something else. Something warm and sweet and slightly exotic that she couldn't identify. Anna, who had been exploring other stalls, returned, to find Elena still talking with Pedro about the suitcase. When Elena mentioned the distinctive scent, Pedro smiled and explained that the lining had been treated with oil from local orange groves, a traditional technique that helped preserve the fabric and added a subtle fragrance that would last for years. He opened several other pieces to demonstrate, and Elena realized that each one carried that same warm, citrusy scent that seemed to capture something essential about the experience of being in this place, far from home and filled with new discoveries. Elena bought the suitcase, though she couldn't entirely explain why. She certainly didn't need more luggage, and the piece was larger than anything she had planned to carry on the train back to Millbrook. But holding it, smelling that distinctive orange fragrance, she felt something shift inside her. For the first time in years, she was making a decision based purely on desire rather than necessity, buying something beautiful simply because it brought her joy. The rest of her time in Mexico passed quickly. She and Anna explored colonial churches and ancient ruins, learned to prepare dishes with ingredients they had never seen before, and spent hours sitting by the ocean, talking about their lives and their dreams and their plans. The orange fragrance that drifted from Elena's suitcase seemed to work like a key, unlocking something in Marcus that had been sealed away since his return from the war. That evening, as Elena unpacked her gifts and souvenirs, sharing stories about each item and the circumstances of its acquisition, Marcus listened with an attention and engagement that felt entirely new. He held the carved wooden figure she had bought him, turning it over in his hands and asking about the artist who had made it. He examined the postcards carefully, studying the images of desert landscapes and coastal villages as if they were maps to places he might actually want to visit someday. But it was when Elena opened the small bottles of spices she had purchased at the market in Ensenada that something truly remarkable happened. The combined scents, cumin and chili powder and vanilla and cinnamon, mingled with the persistent orange fragrance from the suitcase, creating an aromatic symphony that seemed to transport Marcus somewhere far from the careful, controlled environment he had constructed around himself since coming home. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, and when he opened them again, Elena saw tears she hadn't seen him shed since those first difficult weeks after his return. Marcus told her that the smell reminded him of something he had thought he had, lost forever, the ability to experience pure sensory pleasure without analyzing it for potential threats, to be present in a moment of beauty without his mind immediately scanning for what might go wrong. The orange scent, in particular, seemed to bypass the hypervigilant mechanisms that usually filtered his experiences, allowing him to simply enjoy something lovely without reservation or anxiety. Over the following days, Elena noticed that Marcus would find excuses to be near the suitcase, which she had left open in their bedroom so the scent could continue to permeate the air. He would sit nearby while reading the newspaper, or linger in the doorway when Elena was getting dressed, breathing in the warm, citrusy fragrance that had somehow become associated with possibility and renewal. She began to understand that the suitcase represented more than just a souvenir from her travels. It had become a tangible reminder that beauty still existed in the world, that there were experiences yet to be discovered, places yet to be explored. The change in Marcus's demeanor was apparent to everyone who knew him. Mrs. Patterson, who had been so concerned about his withdrawal after the war, commented to Elena that Marcus seemed like his old self again when she encountered him at Murphy's diner. He had lingered to chat with her about her garden, offering to help her plant new roses when the weather warmed up. Mr. Henderson at the hardware store where Marcus occasionally picked up supplies for his construction work mentioned that Marcus had been making jokes with customers, something he hadn't done since before his deployment. But the most significant change was visible in Marcus's relationship with Elena herself. The careful politeness that had characterized their interactions since his return had given way to genuine intimacy and connection. They talked late into the night about Elena's travels, about Marcus's therapy sessions, about plans they wanted to make for their future together. Marcus began initiating physical affection, reaching for Elena's hand while they walked, pulling her close while they watched the sunset from their front porch, kissing her goodbye in the mornings with enthusiasm rather than obligation. Dr. Reynolds, during one of Marcus's regular appointments, noted the dramatic improvement in his patient's presentation and asked what had changed. Marcus tried to explain about the suitcase and its distinctive scent, about how it seemed to have broken through barriers he hadn't even realized he had constructed around his emotional responses. Dr. Reynolds listened thoughtfully, and then offered an observation that surprised both Marcus and Elena when it was shared later. Sometimes healing required not just understanding trauma, but also rediscovering the capacity for wonder and joy that trauma had temporarily obscured. As spring progressed into summer, the orange fragrance gradually faded from Elena's suitcase, but its impact on Marcus seemed to have created lasting changes in his ability to engage with the world around him. He began suggesting activities they might enjoy together: picnics by Miller's Lake, day trips to neighboring towns, even tentative discussions about traveling somewhere new for a brief vacation. Elena watched with joy and amazement as her husband rediscovered his capacity for spontaneity and adventure. The annual summer festival at Miller's Park, which had been such a disaster the previous year, became an opportunity for Marcus to test his renewed resilience and social comfort. This time, when they arrived at the park, Marcus seemed genuinely excited to see old friends and neighbors. When the American Legion fired their ceremonial cannon, Marcus flinched slightly but didn't drop to the ground. Instead, he squeezed Elena's hand and made a joke about how loud noises would probably always startle him, but that didn't mean he had to hide from celebrations. Throughout the evening, Elena watched Marcus interact with people in ways that reminded her powerfully of the man she had married. He teased children gently, offered to help elderly neighbors carry their picnic supplies, and engaged in conversations that seemed to energize rather than exhaust him. When the local band began playing music for dancing, Marcus surprised Elena by asking if she would like to dance with him. They swayed together under the summer stars, surrounded by their community, and Elena felt like they had finally, truly come home to each other. That night, as they prepared for bed, Marcus told Elena that he felt like he had been living underwater since his return from the war, that everything had seemed muffled and distant and difficult to reach. The orange fragrance from her suitcase, he said, had somehow pulled him back to the surface, reminded him that there were experiences worth having and feelings worth experiencing. He thanked her not just for waiting for him through his healing process, but for bringing back something from her travels that had helped him remember who he was beneath the trauma and fear. Elena replied that she thought they had both needed to go away in order to find their way back to each other. Her journey to Mexico had reminded her of her own strength and independence and capacity for joy, while his time alone had allowed him to discover that he could manage without constant support and protection. The suitcase and its distinctive scent had been a catalyst, but the real healing had come from both of them being willing to risk vulnerability and connection after such a long period of careful self-protection. As they settled into sleep, Elena realized that Marcus was humming softly, a tune she recognized from before the war, and that his breathing had the deep, relaxed rhythm of someone who expected pleasant dreams rather than nightmares. The orange fragrance had long since faded from the suitcase, but something it had awakened in Marcus seemed permanent now. A renewed ability to smile genuinely, to laugh spontaneously, to engage with life as an adventure to be embraced rather than a series of threats to be managed. The smile that had been lost to war had finally, completely returned, brought back by love and patience and the unexpected gift of a suitcase that smelled like oranges and carried with it the promise that beautiful things still existed in the world, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to open themselves to wonder once again.